Welcome. My name is Ruth Griffith, and thank you for joining Sno-Isle Libraries for Writing Memoir for a Changing Social Conscience, a World War II story with author Sally Brandle. So I'm going to start out with some housekeeping. Your mics are muted, so please use the chat function to ask questions, and we'll use chat on our end to share any links and websites mentioned today. So after Sally's presentation, we'll have time for questions. And in fact, we will have time for questions throughout. So we'll probably end up having this structured in 3 different parts. And so just go ahead and drop those in the chat and we will get to as many as we can. If you would like to turn on captions for this event, we will drop the instructions in the chat box. This event is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel with captions in a week or 2. When you registered for this event, you were sent links to a very helpful handout, and we will drop that in the chat right now so that you can access it and follow along if you care to. It's not necessary, but it's optional. All right, I'd like to introduce this morning's speaker and this morning's topic. In writing the memoir of a friend's girlhood in Java during World War II, author Sally Brandle was challenged by disturbing truths about privilege and oppression, as well as contradictions in historical accounts, depending on the perspective. Sally today will share strategies for encouraging recall of memories and events when writing or ghostwriting a memoir. Then she'll recount the fascinating life of a girl uncomfortable with her mixed race heritage, caught in the tragedy of wartime in the Pacific theater. This story raises complex questions of race, privilege, politics, and social justice, questions that are as relevant today as they were during 1930s Dutch colonial rule of Java, Indonesia, and the ensuing Japanese occupation during World War II. Since we're covering quite a bit of ground in today's talk, we're going to launch a poll to just gauge the interest in the various parts of this talk. So go ahead and look for that appearing on your screen. While you're doing that, I want to tell you a little bit about Sally. Growing up, Sally read every horse book on the shelves of Butman Fish Library in Saginaw, Michigan. A dare sent her down the path to writing her first story, and memories blossomed to a manuscript after she heard of friends' snippets of life on Java during World War II. Along the way, Sally received writing pointers from authors and editors, so she's thrilled to share what she's learned. Sally Brandle lives in the Puget Sound region. Sally, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us this morning, and welcome.
Ruth, I really appreciate you allowing me to present this information, and I want to thank each and every one of you that have taken the time to come today. And I hope it can be both informative and a discussion. And first and foremost, I'm here to help because I truly believe that we need to capture the stories that are from a personal standpoint. So with that, let's get going. And we will begin with the first slide, Ruth, if you can throw it in there.
Okay, great. So we've got the poll relaunched. I don't know. It looks like there was some trouble with the poll earlier. So, but let's go ahead and see if we can get some results here. They are pouring in. Here we are. And you're seeing those results, Sally?
This is great. Yes.
Okay, great.
That's really
people watching the recording can't see them, but so far it looks like people are interested in all of the above.
Okay.
We asked whether they're interested in writing, collecting stories, history of World War II in the Pacific, and the story of a teenager growing girl in colonial Java, or implications of colonialism, past and present, all of the above. It looks like they're in it for the full gamut. So let's go ahead and share the results.
Perfect. That came in faster than I thought.
Yeah, good. Okay, great.
All right. So the first, I'm going to get rid of that out of my screen. So write the stories, how to collect and organize someone else's spoken memories. So Ruth, let's flick to the next one. There we go. So I think something that's very important to think about is think about what you want to accomplish in the conversation. So is this documenting a very specific event? Are you getting clarity on an event? Are you solving a family mystery? Do you want to talk to a person that has done some interesting work that you have heard about? Maybe somebody that you worked with that had a really interesting work history. So I think it's very important to kind of think about that. And also, I'm a verbal processor. My husband is an internal processor. And I think thinking about those two aspects are important too. So as in the next slide, we're going to learn how to trigger some of those memories. And if you think about the person that you're going to be interviewing, maybe you want to present them before you interview them with some of the questions you're going to ask. So that is an option that you have. Let's shoot to that next one. So are there photo albums available? Are there old newspaper articles? With the book that I wrote, it's 6 years in the life of a woman. She was in her mid to late 90s when we worked on the book. And she literally was thinking back 80 years. And I didn't have access to the photo albums until well into the journey. But they really helped a lot because they gave me a sense of what her life was like. And so if you think that those might be available from the person that you are going to be talking to, offer to help find them, because a lot of times they're in an attic, they're in a garage, they're stuck somewhere. The other thing that can be an unbelievable source, my friend that I wrote the book about, her name is Iris. She started telling me these snippets of stories when we were volunteers. So we knew each other almost 30 years. We didn't begin work on the book until like the 25th year of our friendship. She would mention things like, we used to dance at the Club Harmony. Well, I heard these little bits and pieces of her story of life in colonial Java, but I had no sense of what that club would look like. So I Googled 1930s Harmony Club. Batavia was the colonial name of what is now Jakarta, Java. And pictures started popping up, which gave me a great idea of what the room looked like, what the costumes were they wore, the outfits. And one person's name came up on a site, and that man, who happens to live in Holland, was really helpful in sending me a lot of photos. And I got in touch with him because of the photos I saw on the internet. And then he was a great source because he felt that 1930s colonial Batavia was a great lifestyle. And that was his idea, and he had visited there. So he was a wonderful source. You'll probably find a variety of sources if it's a specific event that you're looking at writing about. Now, personal histories, you're going to have to kind of cast the net a little bit wider to try and find out what was going on in that person's world surrounding maybe the story that you've heard. So once you kind of have a sense of that, then you can think about what might prompt the person I'm going to talk to give some details. So what kind of foods were they eating? What kind of clothes were they wearing? What kind of jobs? And I'm going to let you go to the next slide. There is actually one of the websites that has some great preliminary questions is a woman who I think was going to attend today. She's a heritage fiction writer, Ora Smith, and she put together a blog kind of similar to some of the information I'm going through. But she also has 40 questions you can ask your elderly relatives. And I'm going to add a 41st question about pets. You know, did they have a pet? Would they have liked to have a pet? That's a great opening. And I have a cat in the background that you can probably see, whom I love dearly. So go in with a template. I think that's something that's important. And then when you set the time up with the person you're going to be talking to, I used a smartphone. So bring some kind of recording device. I also was thinking I have an old voice activated recorder I could have used, but my smartphone with the video on it, my friend Iris is gone. We lost her in 2 years ago. She had a wonderful life. It was just before she turned 98. The book had been published. She held it in her hand. So it was really, she was ready to go and be with her beloved husband. So that was fine. But I have these wonderful recordings of her telling some of these fabulous stories, and I cherish them. So find a quiet space where you won't be disturbed. Put the phone between you and the person you're recording and point it towards them, and then plan for at least 30 minutes, because it takes a while to kind of get into it. Iris was a natural storyteller, but a lot of people aren't. So you're going to have to kind of warm them up a little bit, maybe repeat what you've heard or show them the article that you've seen. And
Sally, can I interrupt you just a second? There's a comment asking you to increase volume just
on
a
my
little
mic,
bit. Yeah, if you can. Thank you.
let me see if I can do that. I can talk a little louder, and
Perfect.
We'll see how that works. So start going back to, warm the person up a little bit with maybe repeating the story that you're most interested in, and make it more casual, because not a lot of us are used to being interviewed or interviewing. So it helps to revisit some of those stories or instances that you've seen, and knowing some of the background. If you've done some of your research, like in the last slide, you'll be able to ask them, were there flowers growing where you were, and what were some of the family recipes that you were seeing. So those are going to be helpful prompts. Let's shoot on to the next one. So this is an important one, because my friend ended up in what is known to be the worst internment camp for women and older people and children in the whole Pacific theater that the Japanese had. There were some pretty horrible memories that she had that I didn't necessarily want to bring those back up. So I did side research on what happened in that camp, and I learned things that enriched my story. And the memoir that I wrote, I call it an enhanced memoir, and it's loaded as fiction because I had to create some scenes. Some were because it was tough for her to revisit some of those memories, and some were basically, we're going back 80 years and she's not going to remember verbatim what happened in her life for this 6-year period. So you have to kind of, if you're going to be writing this more as a memoir or a biography, you have to be think about it when you're interviewing the person. Is this possibly going to bother them, and give them an option to opt out? So that would be why, if you're posing some of the questions to them and you're giving them to them first, and they can say, I'm just really not comfortable talking about that. And I think that's a very gracious way to do that. So while you're in the interview, you're definitely going to have some moments of silence. And I'm a verbal processor, so I had to really think about that when Iris was quiet, either she was turning something over in her head, she was thinking about some very emotional reactions, particularly in her younger life when she was starting to date, because my book opens when she's 15 and a half, or she was trying to access a memory that she hadn't thought about in decades. But when she did have a memory, like one of the scenes is that she sees this man walking across their yard and she vows she's going to marry him. So what I stepped back into in the moment was, what was your bedroom like? What did it look like? And, where were you in the house and that kind of thing. So that can open up more details. So think about the quiet moments. Those are okay. And you may go down rabbit holes. You may get totally sidestepped into something else. And those are great too, because you can always circle back to what your intent was. But some of the side paths that you take are some of the best. So there we go. On to the next slide, please.
Great. And we've had one more request for higher volume if you
All right,
can.
let's see.
Thanks.
Let me see if I can up the volume on my mic here. I'm looking at it on my screen. Let's see. Let's mute. Hold on. Yeah, thanks. So we are grabbing my IT familiar son, who thankfully works at home, and he'll see if he can help me with that. Otherwise, I'll continue talking in my special education behavior disorders voice as much as possible. So in the meantime, I think when I've done Zoom book clubs about the book, inevitably at the end of the book, people will say, I wished I would have seen this, your notes 10 years ago for my mom, my grandma, my aunt, my neighbor. And the other thing is, boy, I'm going to start capturing some, oops, I have my IT person here. Thank you, Mark. All right. Can we turn up my mic? Okay. You can keep going. Okay. So what you have to keep thinking though is, don't wait until it's too late. Get that interview with that person that's important to you on the calendar. Do it over the phone, do it via Zoom, do it however you can now. Take the time to do it because once they're gone, they're gone. So my dad fought in the Pacific, but I didn't know any of this history until I researched it for Iris's book, and my dad was gone by then. So that's on this first section. That's the biggest thing that I can tell you is don't wait. Please start capturing those memories. So are there any questions about what we just went through or any comments that I can help you with? Anybody have any questions?
I don't see any questions in the chat box, and it does look like volume is good for folks. They're adjusting it on their devices or
Okay.
So thanks for that. But I'll keep you posted if some questions or comments show up in the chat.
Okay, thank you. Well, then let's move on to the next section. And this was a sort of an interesting realization that I was writing a book, and because it so heavily involved the Dutch colonial lifestyle, and my friend had live-in servants, live-in Javanese servants that lived in an annex. They all ate the same food, but it was two separate groups. There were definitely social injustices in that lifestyle. And when I heard more of the stories, I realized that maybe her family was somewhat different than a lot of the colonial people in how they treated their servants, how they treated the indigenous Javanese people. And one of the big things, her father's family on her paternal grandmother's side were French, and noblesse oblige is a saying, and it's, if you are of noble ancestry, it dictates one to act honorably and generously to others. And there were several things that Iris told me that had happened that made me feel comfortable that her family, particularly her father, really lived that mantra. And because I knew things that had happened with her father, I felt okay taking this story of this young woman who definitely lived a white privileged life until the Japanese invasion, and putting it through her eyes. But I wanted to pull in what else was going on. And so I wanted to kind of walk that path down the colonialism aspect and integrate that into the story without really taking away from her voice. And so that was a very interesting challenge in writing this story. So what I'm going to give in this part of the presentation is really how many different viewpoints on colonialism specific to the Dutch East Indies and Java there were that I sifted through. So I pulled a very basic definition of colonialism from Webster's dictionary: the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. And I also read a book that I thought would help me understand certain aspects of racism, and it's How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram Kendi. We saw him on a nighttime show. I was very impressed with his conceptualization of racism. And so I pulled the statement: at its core, racism is a powerful system that creates false hierarchies of human values. I'm gonna X something out here. Its warped logic extends beyond race, from the way we regard people of different ethnicities or skin colors to the way we treat people of different sexes, gender identities, and body types. We can go on to the next one. That gave me kind of an overall view of how my book might be received. And so with that in mind, I wanted to reach out through different viewpoints. And I think if you read no other viewpoints that are in the reference guide, there's a lot of links, there's a lot of verbiage from the different research that I did. But Tema Magazine, which is an online magazine, has European editors, and I think Viola is actually here today. She's one of the editors. Their very first issue in 2020 is on colonization being a part of white European history, and then following through a part of our history in America. And a lot of my reference points are from 2020 because I wrote the book in 2021 in great part. And so I'm sure there are a lot of things that have been written since then, but Tema had some wonderful core interviews of younger Europeans, a lot of younger Europeans of color, people of color, and their viewpoint on colonization and how we have to decolonize our minds. And I'm going to read something from the publication from Tema's, that first article they wrote. Colonization is part of white European history. The colonizers dominated the world, and their sense of superiority was transmitted through social systems. Today, this heritage is still ingrained in society. Consciously or unconsciously, we still think in colonial patterns. In this issue, Tema is rethinking the European culture of colonial thought and attempts to take its readers on a path toward the decolonization of their minds. While writing about decolonization and racism, it is particularly important to be aware of the space and position we take within this debate. And that kind of hit me. It really made me think. And I went through the interviews, and the one as an author and as a very avid reader that hit me was Lula Bounoir, probably not pronouncing her name correctly, but she wrote, It's time that we all take a look at the books lined up on our shelves. What story do they tell? Whose story do they tell? It's time that we all take a step back from our own story and we start listening to other stories. It's time we decolonize our minds, and this starts with decolonizing the art we are consuming. And that was sort of a benchmark for me after I had written the book to sort of look through it and see where I could maybe bring in some hints of what was happening around Iris's, in the beginning, very privileged life. So from there, I moved into, move forward, please, some other academic viewpoints. And there were a number that were specific to the Netherlands and Indonesia. So the first one that I found was a woman Olivia Tessebeski, who's an international relations tutor at the University of Melbourne in Australia. Once again, this was towards the end of 2020. And she cited a 2019 survey that 50% of Dutch citizens viewed Dutch colonialism as a source of pride. By contrast, only 6% of individuals polled viewed Dutch colonialism as shameful, compared to 23% of Belgian citizens polled about Belgium's colonial rule. Furthermore, alarmingly, over half of the individuals surveyed viewed Dutch colonialization as beneficial or benign for those in Dutch colonies. Many Dutch have long preferred to see themselves as simply victims rather than perpetrators of historical violence. The education system focuses on Germany's occupation of the Netherlands during World War II, not the Dutch occupations of Indonesia and other colonial possessions for centuries. And now this was as of 2020. No Dutch government has ever apologized for violence perpetrated by the old Dutch rulers, Koon, Hoots, and their forces, or any cases of colonial violence committed in Indonesia prior to 1945. Similarly, no Dutch government has apologized for the colonization of Indonesia. And I know from watching the news that within maybe a year and a half ago, this has been brought forward again. So there are more recent things that are happening in present day, but this is one of the references that I use around writing the book. Another one was, interestingly enough, by Indonesia Investments, a website about the colonial period of Indonesia. And that article, I don't know who the author was, stated that there's basically three versions of that colonial period of history: the Indonesian version, the Dutch version, and the academic version. And one of the things that they brought out, which I thought was interesting, is that the Dutch didn't arrive in the archipelago and immediately take over, because it's like 6,000 islands, and maybe 900 are inhabited. So it was a slow process. It took the Dutch several hundred years to really colonize because of the size of the archipelago. And pronouncing that incorrectly, I apologize. But to reach the territorial boundaries of present day Indonesia was a very slow process. And the Dutch trading company had been a major power in Asian trade since the early 1600s, but started to develop this interest to interfere in the indigenous politics on the island of Java in the 18th centuries, and because that would improve their hold on the local economy. So there's that's sort of the academic version of how the Dutch weren't really in power for 300 years, but they were starting to move that way. And what they state is that Indonesia wasn't a unified nation in the late 1500s or early 1600s, but in reality, the country we know as Indonesia was a patchwork of independent indigenous kingdoms that really lacked a feeling of brotherhood or nationalist sentiment. or any other sense of unity. So there were wars between these kingdoms, either inter or intra-island, and those were the rule rather than the exception. So the Dutch system of rule in colonial Java was both direct and dualistic, that alongside the Dutch hierarchy, there existed an indigenous one which functioned as sort of an intermediary between the Javanese peasants and the European civil servants that were basically in power. And the top of the indigenous structure consisted of the Javanese aristocracy. Previously, those were the officials that ran the Mataram administration. But now, or in that time frame of the colonialism, they were only there to execute the will of the Dutch center. So that was an interesting viewpoint that I hadn't thought about either, how long it took the Dutch to actually really get control of all of the resources in what we now call Indonesia. And there are plenty of examples that illustrate that the Dutch were aware of the violent history, including slavery, that were key to turn the Netherlands into one of the most advanced nations. There were statues from the Netherlands that glorify people from the VOC period and the government-led colonial period that have either been removed or criticized by the local Dutch population. So that article concluded with that both Indonesian and Dutch perceptions are slowly moving towards an academic version, because high emotions, whether you're resentful of the Dutch colonialism or you're proud of it, are gradually kind of waning as time goes by, while Indonesia's domestic political situation is stable, and therefore there's less need to create one common history for the area. So that's another viewpoint. And then a really interesting one was this MIT study that they linked the sugar production to greater economic prosperity today. And MIT did this, published an article in 2020, and they opened with the areas of Indonesia where Dutch colonial rulers built a huge sugar producing industry in the 1800s remain more economically productive today than other parts of the country, according to a study co-authored by an MIT economist. The findings show that around villages where the Dutch built sugar processing factories from the 1830s through the 1870s, today there is greater economic activity, more extensive manufacturing, and even more schools, along with higher local education levels. But they really wanted to point out that the conclusions of the study do not represent validations of Dutch colonial rule, which lasted from the early 1600s to 1949 and significantly restricted the rights and self-constructed political institutions of Indonesians. Dutch rule had long-lasting effects in many areas of civic life, and the Dutch cultivation system used forced labor. So they had a lot of tobacco and sugar and spice plantations. So they really wanted it known that they can't determine the net effect of the Dutch cultivation system on Indonesian economic growth. So in the absence of Dutch rule, Indonesia's economy would have certainly grown on its own, but it's impossible to say whether it would have expanded at the same rate, faster, slower, or equivalent to the trajectory it had under the Dutch. And nobody can say what would have happened if the Dutch had never showed up in Indonesia, but the Dutch colonizing Indonesia had all kinds of effects well beyond the scope of their paper, many of them negative for the contemporaneous population. So that was yet another little thing that I thought, well, how do the Indonesian people feel about all the infrastructure that was built, the railroads and the canals and, those type of things. So let's move on to the next slide. I did locate an Indonesian professor, Budiman Minasni, who is at the University of Sydney, and he created a totally different viewpoint. So his viewpoint came from a paper that he wrote on Dutch plantations in Sumatra. And his article was about mostly on workers working in European or Dutch plantations in Sumatra, but he imagined that similar treatment was happening in other parts of Indonesia during colonial times. So he knew that I was getting information from this man in Holland who had all these pictures of Batavia during the 30s. And he said, I think the problem with most Dutch and your friend, which was in reference to Dirk, the man who supplied all the wonderful photos, is that they think that the maids were treated nicely, otherwise they would have lived in the village, and the maids should be privileged or have thought of themselves as privileged to work for the Dutch. And then the professor gave me a link to a novel that was, I believe, created in or written in like 1896, but wasn't actually published until later. And I've provided that link, and then you can get it to be translated in Google translations. But the professor said, as the novel tried to convey, the Dutch made themselves the ruler and the first-class citizens. And one of the Sumatran people wrote that, I learned that in Sumatra, there are two kinds of people in the world, white and colored. The white is the master and ruler in the strictest sense. And the paper that the professor wrote stated slave trading was widely carried out during the Dutch colonial period in Indonesia, especially in North Sumatra, that they needed plantation workers. And starting in 1910, coolies were also shipped from Java as new rubber plantations were established. By 1930, there were 26,000 Chinese, 230,000 Javanese, and 1,000 Indians working on Delhi plantations. And in 1902, a Dutch lawyer named Van der Brand, who lived in Medan, revealed the brutality of the colonial planters towards their workers. And then if we flip to the next slides, there are photos that Professor Minasny provided that were very different from the ones I had gotten from the Dutchman in Holland. And these show how the nanny to a lot of the Dutch children who were indigenous women called baboes, they were always seated either on the floor or standing behind. And we can flip to the next one. So he pointed out a different a disparity in how the servants were treated and thought of that was very interesting. So that gave me yet another idea of what the Indonesian viewpoint was. But I'll be honest, it was really hard for me to try and find things from an Indonesian perspective. And I know part of it is if there are things written, I don't know that those Indonesian stories would have been translated and I would have access to them, because I would really like to talk to somebody whose great grandmother or grandmother worked for one of the Dutch colonials as a young person. Iris was born in 1923. So probably what I would have had to have found was a person that was their grandmother or great grandmother that was in that situation. But I couldn't source any of those people from the other side of the page, from the indigenous person side of the page, that I could measure against what Iris remembered. So I tried to be as accurate as possible, and everything that I wrote in this book, I ran by Iris. And there were absolutely some things that I had, for flow, I had to invent some scenes that were not accurate. And so that was something that we really worked on together. But in the reference guide that I provided, there are excerpts from this book that the translated title is Our Servants in India. And, you know, some of it is pretty jaw-dropping to me at how the people of 1896 really thought. And slavery had been abolished in, I think, 1865. And so here's a short piece of that, which was translated. So this would have been a Dutch colonial person living in Java. I am grateful to them, referring to the servants, that in me they killed every self-importance by offering me their services as a great and beautiful gift to which I was entitled, but that I would nevertheless not possess it without their willingness to give it to me. So that was kind of, the attitude of the day. And I hope you'll take some time to read some of the stanzas that I put in the reference guide, because it opened your eyes to how the people of that 1900 timeframe were actually thinking. And so let's move on to the next slide. Thank you. So that's our servants in India was what we just went over. And then I also found another contemporary Dutch book. It was actually written in 2002, so I'm going to consider it contemporary. And it was about the collapse of a colonial society, the Dutch in Indonesia during the Second World War. And a lot of this was about the time frame. The Japanese invaded, I think March 2nd was the date of March 5th, sorry, in 1942. So this book was written about slightly before, when the Japanese were planning their invasion of the Pacific. And then it goes on in later text to talk about the collapse of the colonial society, because there was from 1945 to 49, the Dutch fought to keep control of Java. And that's actually in the epilogue that I wrote after this book, because my book ends basically in 1945, the story ends, but I had so many people that wanted to know what happened to my heroine, who was Iris, later, that I wrote an epilogue. So I cover some of that period because she and her husband stayed in that area. He was a lieutenant in the army. And so they were there during the period when the Dutch were trying to keep control of their colonies, which is now Indonesia. So back to the book that was written in 2002, the Japanese, the policy took no account for Indonesian interests. And I think in thinking about, the Japanese were sort of lumping together the colonial, Dutch and Europeans, and the indigenous Javanese and Indonesian people. So one of the things that was written is, from the Japanese perspective, that supposedly was translated from a Japanese document: if the acquisition of resources vital to the national defense and the aim of making the troops, which would be Japanese troops, self-sufficient, adversely affect the standard of living of the indigenous people, this must be accepted. And so what I learned from another account is, after the war, Allies found warehouses full of rice that the Japanese had accrued during their occupation. And Iris, at the end of the war, just before she and her mom got out of Chijiang internment camp, which was the worst in the Pacific for women and children, they were down to a half a cup of gruel of it per day. That was what they survived on. And the methods that they had to employ to survive in that camp were amazing. Iris had some advantages because the Japanese needed her, and I'll go into that in a little while. But so somebody, Project Muse, which is this the slide to the right, another person actually did a review of that book, The Collapse of a Colonial Society. And they wrote that no one can deny the deplorable action. And there were a lot of Indonesians that ended up in the Japanese army, particularly young Indonesian men. The Japanese, I would assume, forced many of them in the army, but they also promised the Indonesians, young Indonesian men, that once they won the war, that they would help them go into power of their own country. So that this review of the book, The Collapse of a Colonial Society, goes into one cannot deny such deplorable action by Indonesian and Japanese by all accounts, but we also need to consider the humane conduct of many Japanese and Indonesians in any balanced view of the situation. And one of the things I was most proud to write about was Iris actually had a wonderful interaction with a Japanese general who was a good person. And he actually, I believe, aided her and her mom to get out of the camp. And I need to kind of speed things up. I see we're getting low on time here. So there's let's go to the next slide. There's a contemporary viewpoint from the man that I personally corresponded with, who lives in Holland. He's probably 25 to 30 years younger than Iris. And he had this view that there was no slavery in the Dutch East Indies, and particularly compared to America, and that, excuse me, the people who were in 1935-ish Dutch East Indies would have had no idea about slavery. And he felt I sort of was portraying a different viewpoint than what Iris would have had. But I asked Iris about how things were. Were there people of color at the ballet school she went to? No. Were there people of color at the Catholic school she went to? No. Did her family really entertain many Javanese or people of color? No. But I also know for a fact that if her family wouldn't have treated their servants that lived on site, and particularly the Javanese veterinarian that her father used, her life would have been a lot different. So with that, I'm going to breeze through. Let's skip on a slide, please. So this is a timeline of events on Java as they portrayed to the European front. And I think so much was written about the European war, but not a whole lot was written about the Pacific. And like I said, my dad served in the Pacific. I knew very little about it because he wouldn't talk about it. So hopefully you can enlarge this if you pull the reference guide, the download. And I tried to kind of lay out what was happening in the world, which was with what was happening in Iris's life. Let's skip on a slide here. And, this is Iris's house on the left with her brothers. You see the servants in the background. That's Iris and her mom. You notice how well they're dressed. These are all prior to the war. Keep popping through these. These are Iris's servants. On the lower right is Ouija, which was her nanny, her babu. And then the picture on the left, the woman in the lower right corner was her babu. On the right, this is Iris's mom was a seamstress. This is an outfit that she wore attending a costume party with her fiance. So, there were some real, it was a world of privilege. And very shortly after this, it was upended by the Japanese invasion on March 5th. Keep popping through the slides. Iris was a horsewoman. That was one thing that we had in common. And she had her own mansion named after her. Actually, after her parents lost all their money, they moved into a slightly smaller house, but they still took in boarders and were able to survive. That's one of the horses that her dad used to teach riding lessons on. Let's keep going through. I think there's only a couple more slides, but I love the last photograph. So that's Iris before she left and never went back to Java. She made it a point to see, she had children by that time. This was in circa 1949. So she and her husband went through that war period when Indonesia was fighting to become their own country and to take it back from the Dutch. And that's her nanny. Another wonderful group of people that I interacted with it's called the Indo Project, TIP. And the Indo Project, and one of the women who is Indo, which is Indo-European, they call themselves Indos, because so many people, men that moved to Java, married Javanese women. So because these people were not called Indonesian then, they would have been Javanese women. So many Dutch men were over there. They married Javanese women, and those people today consider themselves Indos. So the Indo Project is a group of those folks. And I love this photo because you can see Iris grew up with this nanny, and she never saw her again. She never went back. And how I got in touch with the Indo Project, a woman who's a psychologist wrote a paper about how her family, who were Indos, they were of mixed heritage like Iris, Indonesian and European. In 1949, they had to leave the country because the Indonesians did not want them there. And about 300,000 European and Indo folks were repatriated to Holland. And a lot of them didn't stay very long and ended up, many of them in California and in Australia. But Iris did get to see her nanny right before then, but many of them never could go back because of tensions in the years following. Now, of course, they could and can, but this woman from the Indo Project wrote that she feels that trauma of losing your country and never being able to go back generationally comes down through emotionally. And so that was a really interesting aspect. So now, last slide, on to questions. And if there were any questions, Ruth, that were before, let's open those up.
Thank you. There are some questions. So yeah, here's Viola Karsten joined us. It's really wonderful. And she had a comment. She said, actually, end of last year, the Dutch Prime Minister apologized for the country's role in the history of slavery. And she passed along a link. So I will go ahead and put that in the chat so that everyone can see it. But she says proper actions still need to follow. And as you said, there's still a lot to be done, particularly when it comes to the educational system. And then there's another question. It says, how did Iris feel about your incorporating the multiple cultural viewpoints into her story? Did it cause her any concern? Did she understand why you wanted to do that?
That's an excellent question. And in order for me to write the story, I think she understood that I had to sort of weigh it out. But I have to tell you, so Ruth and I had this really interesting original interaction. There is a video of Iris on TIP, on the Indo Project. And Iris had this sort of innate elegance. And she had this French Countess grandmother that lived in Batavia with them all the time she was growing up until she was like 22. And her Indonesian grandmother, that with Indonesian heritage, was in Holland with her Dutch grandfather. So Iris wasn't around that person. And Iris carried in her whatever kind of being, she had been brought up to be a lady. But she also was a nurse. And so I think with what she went through, she mitigated out some of that sense of entitlement into becoming a full-fledged RN over in the States. And she was actually asked in an interview, and I think this is sort of answering the question. So you were in a Japanese internment camp. How are you going to treat, this was in Seattle, mind you, how are you going to treat Japanese patients? And Iris said, well, why would I treat them any differently? They weren't the people that hurt me, because she was hurt. And so I think she realized, and we talked a little bit about it, that when we were writing this story, we had to sort of do a somewhat of a circular view, because we're writing her story from 1939 to 1945, but it's being published in modern day. And she did negate some scenes. In fact, Dirk, the man that was so helpful, wanted me to put a scene in one of the opening scenes where she's doing a ballet performance for her mother's 50th birthday. And she's going to perform ballet because she was taught ballet. And he wanted a scene in where prior to Iris performing, there would have been some Indo women, Indo girls doing a performance. And Iris said, no, there were no Indo people there. So she would correct me when I didn't do something right. But when I would ask her, like, did you have dinner with your servants? Was that common? And she said, no. My father made sure that the children of the people that lived on site went to school, but they weren't like college educated. She said, I think it would have been uncomfortable for both of us. But when it came to the end of the book, this is a little spoiler alert, but those Javanese servants were still in her house. Her and her mom escaped and got they escaped. They were able to leave the internment camp. They didn't escape. They were allowed to leave because of their Indonesian bloodline. They went back to the house. The servants were still there, and they hadn't even moved into the big quarters. And they welcomed Iris and her mom. And the Javanese veterinarian had offered to hide to their father a lot of trunks full of some of their silver and their photos and things like that. He put his own family in danger to do that. So I think she understood full well that there were these layers of her life surrounding what she saw. Does that kind of answer it, Ruth?
Oh yeah, I think that's really helpful. I feel like we could have a day-long event on this, but we don't have the time. So I'm just going to go to a comment. Someone just commented when you were talking about the poor treatment of Indonesians that they are still treated this way in many households today. And then another comment when you were talking about the difficulty of getting the Indonesian perspective, she said, I've had the same struggle looking into slave perspectives in the US. My ancestors owned slaves, and I want to know, what did the slaves feel and experience? So another comment. So
I,
getting, oh, go ahead.
well, I actually have a writer friend who might be able to help you, Eliana West. And she has a website, and she is of mixed heritage. And I think she's doing a lot of that research right now. So she's a local Seattle author. You might be able to contact her through her website and see if she can help you. But I think more of that is coming out. And I don't know who told me this, but someone said, it might have been Iris, maybe it was Iris's mom. You don't educate the people that you want to keep underneath you. So unfortunately, unless those verbal stories were passed on, they weren't written down necessarily by the people that were experiencing them. And I think that's the really tough part of this, that I had a really hard time getting the flip side. Fortunately, I found this Indonesian professor, and boy, I had two total opposites. I had my man that had given me the pictures who lives in Holland, and I had the Indonesian professor who's actually a professor of like environmental sciences. So it was really lovely that he offered to help at all. But that's the best that I can do with slavery in colonial America. Were there any other questions?
Yeah, one person asked, did you consult any anthropological studies of the indigenous people, either written by Europeans or Indonesians?
I did not. That would have been a wonderful thing to consult, and I just did not think about doing that. Part of when I was writing this, so Iris was around 95 when we started this project, and I started it as a timeline. And then I did some genealogy. Actually, Dirk was really helpful because during genealogy from somebody that most of their ancestors were in Europe or Indonesia, it was hard to get records. Well, then by the time I got all that amassed and I started writing the book and was asking her about things, her health was somewhat declining. And so, I'm loading all this into my brain about how I have to wrap in some of these other perspectives, but I might be losing Iris. So I believe one of my editors is probably on this event today too, CJ O'Bray, who was instrumental in really getting this book together. My other editor, Sharon Rowe. So I had two professional editors help me with this book. They were great about trying to balance these perspectives, but stay true to the story. And I never thought about looking in that domain. I wished I would have started this project when I first met Iris when she was in her 60s, but I hadn't heard all these wonderful stories. They just kind of filtered in. So that would have been a great thing to do. And maybe moving forward, I can, if you have any links to any of those, please throw them on, and I will add them to my site.
Excellent. Well, we're getting to time. I just want to pass along that there's a lot of notes of appreciation today. Someone says, I would like to thank Sally for a complex discussion of colonialism. My husband's family is from India, and they see colonialism in India in a complex, nuanced way, and so on. Someone says, I'm starting to write stories on my Hawaiian European ancestors during 1800s. This was very informative and inspiring. Mahalo. This is fantastic. I appreciate how you share your understanding of current discussion and attention to bias and unconscious bias. Yeah, and then so anyway, I think we're going to have to wrap it up. I just want to thank you so much, Sally, for we did so much back and forth in talking about this, and I ended up just saying, Sally, can you just present the whole thing? There's just so much to be gained from all your experiences. So I want to thank everybody in our audience today, and thank you for submitting your chats. We have recorded this program today if you want to revisit it. Once again, that reference document, we will, once this appears on our YouTube channel, we will provide a link to that document in the comments. And so you can find that on the Sno-Isle YouTube channel. It'll probably be a week or two. And you can find recordings of other past events by visiting Sno-Isle's website, clicking on events, and then clicking on event recordings.
And Ruth and Shannon, I really appreciate your help putting this together. Ruth, you're just a gem. So thank you.
I think we're going to be lifelong friends, Sally. All right. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye, y'all, and have a great day.